The alarm clock sang its familiar tune at 5:30 in the morning, and Kesha Williams reached over to silence it with the practiced ease of someone who'd been waking at this hour for over 2 decades. Her small apartment in the Riverside neighborhood was modest. Nothing like the grand homes some of her colleagues owned, but it was hers, filled with warmth, family photos, and the faint scent of vanilla candles she'd lit the night before while reviewing case files. She moved through her morning routine with quiet purpose, a simple breakfast of oatmeal and coffee, a moment of prayer at her kitchen table, and then the careful selection of her outfit. Today was Casual Friday at the courthouse, so she chose a navy blazer over a cream blouse and comfortable slacks. Professional, but not overly formal. Her briefcase sat by the door, stuffed with documents for the Peterson hearing, a custody case that had kept her up late. Making notes and considering the welfare of 2 children caught in their parents' bitter dispute, Kesha paused at the mirror near her front door, adjusting her hair and studying her reflection. At 48 years old, she saw the same woman she'd always been raised by, a single mother who cleaned office buildings at night, who'd worked 3 jobs to put herself through law school, who'd never forgotten where she came from or who she represented when she put on those judicial robes. The mirror reflected not just a judge, but a daughter of struggle, a symbol of hope for her community, and a woman who carried the weight of justice on her shoulders every single day. The drive to the courthouse took 20 minutes through streets she knew by heart. She passed the church where she'd sung in the choir as a girl, the community center where she volunteered on weekends, the elementary school where she gave talks about career possibilities to children who looked like her and needed to see what was possible. This city was her home. These people were her neighbors. And this courthouse, the place she'd served for 23 years, was sacred ground where she fought daily to ensure everyone received fair treatment under the law. As she pulled into the parking lot, the morning sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber. It should have been a beautiful beginning to an ordinary day. Kesha gathered her briefcase, locked her car, and walked toward the courthouse steps with the confidence of someone who belonged there. She had no way of knowing that in the next few minutes, everything she believed about justice, authority, and human dignity would be tested in ways she'd never imagined. She had no way of knowing that Officer Marcus Rodriguez was waiting at those steps, ready to shatter her world with his hatred. Part 2. When respect becomes invisible. Officer Marcus Rodriguez stood at his post like a sentinel guarding a fortress, his 3 stripes gleaming in the morning light. 15 years on the force had carved lines into his face and hardened something deep inside him, something that had perhaps always been there, waiting for a uniform and a badge to give it permission to emerge. He watched the parking lot with predatory attention, his jaw working a piece of gum as he sized up each person approaching the building. When he spotted Kesha walking toward the entrance, something dark flickered across his features. He didn't see a judge, a professional, or even a human being deserving of basic courtesy. He saw only what his prejudice allowed him to see: a black woman carrying a briefcase, and in his twisted worldview, that meant only one thing: trouble. "Courthouse is for official business only," Rodriguez barked, stepping directly into her path with the aggressive stance of someone eager for confrontation. His hand moved deliberately to the handcuffs on his belt, not because he needed them yet, but because the gesture itself was a threat, a show of power meant to intimidate and diminish. Kesha stopped, her heart rate quickening slightly, but her voice remained steady. "Good morning, officer. I do have official business here." She shifted her briefcase to her left hand, preparing to reach for the judicial identification she carried in her jacket pocket, the same ID she'd shown 1,000 times before, the same credential that granted her access to every courtroom in the building. But Rodriguez wasn't interested in identification. He was interested in dominance and putting someone in their place. and exercising the kind of power that had gone unchecked for far too long. His eyes narrowed with something that looked almost like satisfaction. "Don't reach for anything," he snapped. Though her hands were completely visible, her movements slow and non-threatening. "You people always have excuses. Always think you're special." The words landed like stones. "You people." Kesha had heard those words before in law school when professors doubted her abilities. In courtrooms when attorneys assumed she was a defendant rather than a judge. In stores where security followed her through aisles. But hearing them here, on the steps of the courthouse where she dedicated her entire adult life to serving justice, felt like a betrayal of everything she'd worked for. Behind Rodriguez, Officer Thompson had already pulled out his phone, recording with the gleeful anticipation of someone expecting entertainment. Another officer, Davis, drifted closer, forming a wall of blue uniforms that sent a clear message to the growing crowd of onlookers. "We own this space, and we decide who belongs here." What? None of them understood what their arrogance and hatred blinded them from seeing was that security cameras, mounted every 15 feet, were capturing everything in crystal clarity. The system that Judge Williams herself had fought to install 2 years ago was now creating an unalterable record of their corruption, building a case against them with every hateful word and gesture. Part 3. The violence of assumptions. The slap came so suddenly that Kesha didn't have time to brace herself. Rodriguez's open palm connected with her face with brutal force, the sound echoing across the courthouse steps like a gunshot. Her head snapped to the side, her carefully pinned hair coming loose, and pain exploded across her cheek in waves of heat and shock. The briefcase flew from her grip, documents scattering across the wet concrete, the Peterson custody files landing in a puddle, the official court seal bleeding ink into the water. "Another ghetto rat trying to sneak in," Rodriguez snarled, advancing on her as she stumbled backward against the cold courthouse wall. His hand shot out, fingers wrapping around her throat, pressing hard enough to make breathing difficult. "Filthy animals like you belong in cages, not courthouses." Through the ringing in her ears and the spots dancing in her vision, Kesha's mind remained sharp. 23 years of judicial experience had trained her to stay calm under pressure, to observe, to remember. She cataloged every detail, the exact words Rodriguez used, the witnesses gathering around them, the way Thompson was still recording and laughing, the camera angles that would later prove invaluable. Evidence. Everything was evidence. "Please," she managed, her voice strained but controlled, despite the hand at her throat. "If you would just look at my identification." "Shut up." Rodriguez twisted her arms behind her back with unnecessary roughness, metal handcuffs biting into her wrists. The pain was sharp and immediate, but worse than the physical hurt was the humiliation of being treated like a criminal on the steps of her own courthouse. "You're going to learn what happens when you disrespect law enforcement." A crowd had formed, now courthouse employees heading to work, lawyers arriving for morning hearings, citizens reporting for jury duty. Kesha could see the discomfort on some faces, the way people averted their eyes or hurried past. This was Officer Rodriguez, after all. Everyone knew his reputation. He had friends in powerful places, connections that made him seem untouchable. No one wanted to be the person who challenged him, who risked becoming his next target. Among the crowd, Bailey Henderson, a bailiff who'd worked at the courthouse for 12 years, frowned deeply. Something about the woman in handcuffs seemed familiar, the way she carried herself even in this moment of degradation, the quiet dignity that clung to her despite everything. But with Rodriguez blocking most of his view and the woman's face turned away from the bruising, he couldn't quite place her. Later, this moment would haunt him, the knowledge that he'd been so close to recognizing her, so close to stopping this nightmare before it went any further. Rodriguez began marching Kesha toward the courthouse entrance, making a spectacle of her restraint. This was what he lived for: the power, the authority, the ability to make people submit. Today felt particularly satisfying. Another story he'd tell in the break room about maintaining order and teaching respect. Part 4. The way of false accusations inside the courthouse. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Rodriguez shoved Kesha into a small holding room. The space was cramped and windowless, designed for temporary detention, and the chair he forced her into was bolted to the floor. He stood over her, straightening his uniform with the self-satisfied air of someone who believed he'd done his job well. Someone who'd never once questioned whether his job included brutality and hatred. Kesha sat quietly, her cheek throbbing where his hand had struck her. A bruise was already forming, dark purple spreading across her brown skin like storm clouds. But her eyes remained focused, watching as Rodriguez pulled out the arrest report and began writing his fiction with practiced ease. "Trespassing," he muttered as he scribbled, his voice carrying casual confidence. "Resisting arrest, attempting to access restricted areas, assaulting an officer." Each lie flowed smoothly onto the official form. Years of fabrication, making the process almost routine. "You know none of that is true," Kesha said softly, her voice steady despite everything. Rodriguez looked up, his eyes cold and empty of remorse. "Truth is what I say it is. My word against yours, and guess whose word carries weight in this building?" He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "I've been doing this for 15 years. The system knows who to believe." Down the hall, the morning's court proceedings should have been starting, but something was wrong. Janet Morrison, Judge Williams's clerk for 8 years, stood in the empty courtroom feeling increasingly anxious. The judge was never late, not once in all their years working together. Judge Williams ran her courtroom like clockwork, always arriving early to review files and prepare for the day ahead. Janet had sent 3 text messages, each more urgent than the last, but received no response. "Has anyone seen Judge Williams?" Janet asked Patricia from the records department, who was passing by with an armload of files. "No, but there was some commotion outside earlier," Patricia replied, pausing. "Rodriguez arrested some woman trying to break in. Really went after her too. I heard it got physical." Something cold settled in Janet's stomach. "What did she look like?" Patricia shrugged. "I didn't see clearly from where I was, but she was African American, professionally dressed, carrying a briefcase. Rodriguez was really laying into her, calling her all kinds of names." Janet's phone slipped from her fingers, clattering to the floor. She knew. Somehow, with a certainty that made her knees weak, she knew. Meanwhile, Rodriguez was coordinating his story with Thompson and Davis in the hallway outside the holding room. "She was aggressive from the start," he instructed them, his voice low. "Refused to comply with lawful orders, made threatening gestures. We all saw the same thing, right?" "Whatever you say, Rodriguez," Thompson agreed, still reviewing the video on his phone carefully edited to start after the initial assault, showing only Kesha's attempts to explain herself, making it look like defiance. "You know Judge Harrison is sitting in for criminal cases today, right? He always backs the badge." Rodriguez smiled, feeling the last pieces falling into place. Judge Harrison was old school, tough on crime, and most importantly, someone who never questioned police testimony. This would be easier than he'd thought. Part 5. The mask begins to crack the courtroom, filled quickly once word spread about the morning's arrest. Lawyers abandoned their coffee in the hallway. Court reporters from other floors found excuses to observe. And even administrative staff who rarely set foot in courtrooms suddenly discovered urgent business in courtroom 3. Everyone wanted to see Officer Rodriguez in action again. Wanted to witness him maintain order against another person who'd supposedly threatened courthouse security. Judge Harrison presided with the stern, demeanor he'd cultivated over 30 years on the bench. Old school in every sense of the word. He believed in law and order above all else, in the thin blue line that separated civilization from chaos. He'd never met a police officer whose word he doubted, never questioned the narratives presented by men and women in uniform. "Officer Rodriguez," Judge Harrison began once the proceedings opened, "please provide your account of this morning's incident." Rodriguez stood at the witness stand, every inch the confident officer. His uniform was crisp, his posture military straight, his voice steady and practiced. "Your Honor, I was conducting routine security checks at the courthouse entrance when I encountered the defendant attempting to breach our perimeter. She was carrying suspicious documents, acting erratically, and became violent when I attempted to verify her identity. From the defendant's table, still in handcuffs, Kasha watched him weave his lies with the skill of someone who'd done this many times before. The bruise on her face throbbed with each heartbeat, a physical reminder of his brutality, but she remained perfectly still, her hands folded, her expression neutral. She'd spent 23 years in courtrooms. She knew how to wait, how to listen, how to let someone dig their own grave with words. "The defendant claimed to be someone important," Rodriguez continued, adding a dismissive laugh that drew chuckles from Thompson and Davis in the gallery. "They always do, lawyers, judges, senators. It's a common tactic used by people trying to avoid accountability for their criminal behavior." Prosecutor Walsh, a veteran of 15 years who'd built her career on convictions, nodded along with approval. She'd worked with Rodriguez before, trusted his word, believed in supporting law enforcement without question. "Officer Rodriguez, did the defendant physically assault you when you attempted to perform your duties?" "Yes, ma'am. When I attempted to verify her identity and secure the courthouse, she became physically aggressive. I had no choice but to use minimum necessary force to protect myself and ensure the safety of everyone in the building." The words "minimum necessary force" hung in the air like an obscene joke. In the gallery, Henderson the bailiff shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The woman in handcuffs had lifted her head slightly, and even from across the room, something about the angle of her jaw, the way she held herself despite everything, nagged at his memory. Where had he seen her before? "These people," Rodriguez continued, his confidence growing with each unchallenged statement, "think they can just walk into any building, claim any identity they want. And when they're caught in their lies, they scream discrimination. Well, not in my courthouse. Not on my watch. My courthouse." The words echoed through the room with stunning arrogance. Several court employees exchanged uncomfortable glances. The presumption was breathtaking even for Rodriguez, who'd never been known for humility. Then Kasha spoke for the first time, her voice cutting through the courtroom with unexpected authority. "Officer Rodriguez, you testified that your body camera malfunctioned this morning. Is that correct?" Rodriguez's jaw tightened slightly, the first crack in his confident facade. "Yes, technical difficulties. These things happen. How convenient," Kasha murmured, just loud enough for the court reporter's fingers to capture every word. "How remarkably convenient." "Part 6. The truth demands its day, Your Honor," Rodriguez said, turning back to Judge Harrison with renewed urgency. "I've served this courthouse faithfully for 15 years. My record speaks for itself. I've made hundreds of arrests, kept this building safe, and always followed proper procedure." His record did indeed speak for itself, though not in the way Rodriguez imagined. At that very moment, 2 floors above in the Chief Judge's chambers, Margaret Carter was receiving an urgent call from the courthouse security director. Her face had gone pale as she watched the surveillance footage on her computer screen footage that showed the truth of what had happened on those courthouse steps. Back in the courtroom, Judge Harrison was preparing to move forward with sentencing. Does the defendant wish to make any statement before this court renders its judgment? Yes, Your Honor, Kesha said, rising slowly. The handcuffs clinked softly as she stood. But despite everything, the assault, the bruise darkening her face, the humiliation of being treated like a criminal, she moved with a dignity that made the entire courtroom pause and take notice. Thank you for allowing me to speak, she began, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention in legal settings. This wasn't the rambling defense Judge Harrison had expected from someone Rodriguez had arrested. First, I'd like to address Officer Rodriguez's claim about his body camera malfunction. Kesha's eyes found Rodriguez, who was beginning to shift his weight nervously. Officer Rodriguez, are you aware that this courthouse maintains comprehensive surveillance coverage, with cameras positioned every 15 feet along all approaches to the building? The color began draining from Rodriguez's face like water from a broken vessel. Furthermore, Kesha continued, her tone measured and precise, are you aware that all officer body cameras in this jurisdiction automatically upload footage to the county's secure cloud storage system every 60 seconds, regardless of whether the local device appears to be functioning? It's a redundancy system implemented precisely to prevent the kind of convenient malfunctions you've described. Prosecutor Wall shot to her feet. Objection, Your Honor. The defendant can't simply make evidentiary demands. Actually, Kesha interrupted smoothly, under Brady v. Maryland, I have the constitutional right to access all potentially exculpatory evidence. Additionally, as a pro se defendant representing myself, I'm entitled under the Sixth Amendment to present evidence in my own defense. I'm simply establishing the foundation for that evidence. The legal citations flowed from her lips with the practiced ease of someone who had spent decades in courtrooms, not as a defendant, but as someone who understood every nuance of criminal procedure. Judge Harrison's frown deepened. This was not normal. This woman spoke like an attorney, carried herself like someone with authority. In the back row, Henderson the bailiff suddenly went rigid, his eyes widening with recognition and horror. The way she moved, the way she spoke, the authoritative tone, his mind finally made the connection, and his blood turned to ice. He knew exactly who she was, and the implications of what was unfolding before him made him feel physically ill. Officer Rodriguez testified that I was trespassing, Kesha continued, undeterred. However, I was on a public sidewalk, approaching the main entrance during normal business hours. Under the Supreme Court's decision in Hague versus Committee for Industrial Organization, public sidewalks adjacent to government buildings are traditional. Public forums where all citizens have a full constitutional right to be present. Rodriguez's attorney, he hadn't thought he'd need one, was nowhere to be found. He stood alone, watching his carefully constructed story crumble with each word this woman spoke. Your Honor, Kesha said, her voice softening slightly but losing none of its power. I have documentation that will conclusively establish both my identity and my legitimate reason for being at this courthouse this morning. She reached slowly, deliberately into her jacket pocket and pulled out a leather wallet. Even from across the room, as she opened it, the gold judicial seal was unmistakable, catching the light, reflecting justice itself back into a room that had nearly been robbed of it. Part 7. When power finally answers to truth, Judge Harrison called an immediate 15-minute recess. But the courthouse erupted into controlled chaos the moment his gavel fell. Word spread like lightning through a summer storm. Whispered conversations in hallways became urgent phone calls. Court staff literally ran toward courtroom 3, and attorneys abandoned their own cases to witness what everyone was now calling the reckoning. In a private holding room, Henderson stood before Kesha, his face ashen with guilt and horror. Judge Williams, Your Honor, I'm so sorry. I didn't recognize you at first, and when they brought you in handcuffed, I should have known. I should have. Henderson. Breathe, Kesha said gently, her voice carrying the same kindness she'd always shown to courthouse staff who treated everyone with respect. You weren't part of what Rodriguez did. You didn't assault me, didn't lie about me, didn't fabricate charges. But I need you to do something for me now. Anything, Your Honor, anything at all. Go to my chambers. In the closet, you'll find my judicial robes, the black ones with the gold trim that I wore at my 20th anniversary ceremony. And Henderson, bring my gavel too. The wooden one from my swearing-in ceremony 23 years ago. As Henderson rushed out, Kesha picked up her phone, finally returned to her, and dialed Chief Judge Margaret Carter's private line. Kesha, thank God, you're all right. We heard there was an incident, and when security showed me the footage, Margaret's voice cracked with emotion. What that monster did to you. Margaret, I need you to secure all surveillance footage from this morning. Every angle, every camera, every second. Multiple backup copies on separate servers. Already done. The security director called me 20 minutes ago. Kesha, we have everything. Every word Rodriguez said. Every moment of violence. It's worse than you can imagine. Oh, I can imagine quite well, Margaret, Kesha replied quietly, touching the bruise on her face. I lived it. But now it's time to ensure that no one else ever has to. Meanwhile, in the courtroom, Rodriguez sat at the defense table, his world collapsing around him. Officers Thompson and Davis had quietly disappeared, abandoning him to face the consequences alone. His phone buzzed constantly with messages, other officers who'd heard what was happening, warning him to get a lawyer, to leave town, to do something, anything. But there was nowhere to run. Not from this. Not from the truth that had been captured in high-definition video, stored in multiple secure locations, backed by witnesses and evidence so overwhelming that no amount of lies or connections could save him. When court resumed, the gallery was standing room only. The air itself seemed charged with anticipation and dread. Judge Harrison had recused himself. He'd literally run from the courtroom upon learning the defendant's true identity. Horrified by how close he'd come to being complicit in this travesty, then came the announcement that would burn itself into everyone's memory forever. All rise. Henderson's voice boomed with more authority and emotion than anyone had ever heard from the normally soft-spoken bailiff. Court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Kesha Williams presiding. The silence that followed was absolute and profound. Rodriguez's legs gave out completely, and he collapsed into his chair, a grown man reduced to trembling shock. The power he'd wielded so carelessly just hours ago evaporated like morning mist, leaving him exposed and defenseless. Judge Williams entered in her full judicial robes, and suddenly everyone understood the magnitude of what had occurred. This wasn't just any judge. This was their judge. The woman who had presided over this courthouse for 23 years with fairness and compassion, who was known throughout the legal community for her integrity and wisdom, who had fought tirelessly for justice reform. The woman Rodriguez had called a filthy animal. She took her rightful place behind the bench, picked up her gavel, and looked directly at Officer Rodriguez with eyes that had seen everything and would now ensure that everything was answered for. Part 8. Justice finally speaks. Officer Rodriguez, Judge Williams said quietly from behind the bench, her voice carrying perfect clarity through the silent courtroom. You may remain standing. Rodriguez couldn't have stood if his life depended on it. His legs had turned to water, his breath came in shallow gasps, and he sat trembling at the defense table as judge. Williams pulled out a tablet and connected it to the courtroom's display system. The court will now review the evidence of this morning's events, she announced. Surveillance footage began playing on the large screen mounted on the wall. The courtroom watched in horrified silence as the truth unfolded in crystal clarity. There was Rodriguez, spotting Kesha and immediately moving to block her path. There was the aggressive posture, the hand moving to his handcuffs. Then came the moment that made several people in the gallery gasp audibly, the unprovoked slap that sent Judge Williams's head snapping sideways, her briefcase flying, documents scattering. But it was the audio that truly damned him. Rodriguez's voice, clear and unmistakable. Another ghetto rat trying to sneak in. Filthy animals like you belong in cages, not courthouses. Several people in the gallery stood and left, unable to watch anymore. Others sat transfixed, witnessing the complete destruction of a man who had thought himself untouchable, who had believed his badge gave him permission to brutalize and degrade with impunity. The footage continued, showing Rodriguez's hand at her throat, the unnecessary violence as he handcuffed her, Thompson laughing in the background. Every moment was captured from multiple angles, creating an indisputable record of abuse, hatred, and betrayal of everything a police officer's oath was supposed to represent. When the video ended, Judge Williams opened a thick folder. "Officer Rodriguez, let's examine your distinguished career, shall we?" Her voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the quiet words. 47 formal complaints in 15 years. Let me share some highlights with this court. She proceeded methodically, revealing a pattern of abuse that should have ended his career years ago. Rosa Delgado, a 72-year-old grandmother brutalized for speaking Spanish in public. Jamal Washington, an honor student arrested and beaten for wearing a hoodie. Dr. Michael Johnson, a surgeon, detained for the crime of living in the wrong neighborhood. Each case represented a life damaged, a family traumatized, a community made to fear the very people who were supposed to protect them. Your arrest statistics are particularly illuminating, Judge Williams continued. 87% of your arrests involved people of color, in a district that's only 58% minority. Your use of force reports show physical violence in 63% of arrests involving black suspects, compared to just 12% involving white suspects. This isn't law enforcement, Officer Rodriguez. This is systematic oppression, hiding behind a badge. Rodriguez's hastily summoned attorney was scribbling notes frantically, knowing there was no defense for any of this. No argument that could counter the mountain of evidence. But here's what you need to understand, Judge Williams said, her voice dropping lower. This morning, you didn't just assault a random citizen, though that alone would warrant the severest punishment. You assaulted a federal judge who's been working with the FBI's Civil Rights Division for the past 18 months to investigate patterns of police misconduct in this jurisdiction. This case, Officer Rodriguez, is now federal. The revelation hit the courtroom like an earthquake. Federal charges meant no local protection. No friendly prosecutors willing to look the other way. No police union lawyers who could make problems disappear. Rodriguez finally found his voice, though it emerged as barely a whisper. I didn't know. I didn't know who you were. Judge Williams stood, walking around the bench to face him directly, something she rarely did, reserved for moments when the gravity of justice demanded it. You didn't know because you didn't care to look. You saw a black woman and made assumptions based on nothing but your own prejudice and hatred. You saw someone you thought was powerless and decided to assert your dominance, to remind someone you viewed as beneath you of what you imagined was their place. She paused, letting her words settle over the courtroom like a heavy blanket. Officer Rodriguez, you said this morning that people like me need to learn our place. Well, let me tell you exactly what my place is. My place is on this bench, ensuring that bullies and bigots like you can never again hide behind a badge while terrorizing innocent citizens. My place is standing as a barrier between corrupt power and vulnerable people. My place is proving that justice, though sometimes delayed, eventually finds its voice. The gavel came down with the sound of finality. Officer Marcus Rodriguez, you are hereby found guilty of assault on a federal officer, violation of civil rights under color of authority, filing false police reports, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. You are sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Your badge is stripped, your pension is forfeited, and your name will stand as a warning to anyone who believes that power gives them the right to oppress. Rodriguez collapsed completely, his face in his hands. His career and freedom destroyed in a single morning, destroyed by the same hatred and arrogance that had defined his 15 years of corruption. But Judge Williams wasn't finished. Officers Thompson and Davis, please stand. The two men who'd laughed while recording the assault were escorted into the courtroom in handcuffs. You are charged as co-conspirators and accessories. You will face federal prosecution for your role in this travesty. The gavel fell again, and justice, real justice, finally echoed through a courthouse that had nearly lost its way. Part 9. When justice ripples through everything 6 months later, the transformation was complete and profound. The entire justice system had been shaken to its foundation and rebuilt on principles that had been forgotten or ignored for far too long. Officer Marcus Rodriguez sat in federal prison, his days of power and intimidation replaced by the reality he'd inflicted on so many others: powerlessness, fear, and the slow march of time with no hope of escape. His badge was gone, melted down, and reformed into a memorial plaque. His pension had been forfeited, the funds redirected to a victim compensation program. His name had become synonymous with everything law enforcement should never be, a cautionary tale taught at every police academy in the nation. The federal investigation Judge Williams had initiated quietly, carefully, over 80 months of documented patterns, finally came to full light. The Department of Justice Civil Rights Division descended on the police department like a cleansing storm. 12 officers were terminated for various acts of misconduct. 4 supervisors faced criminal charges for covering up complaints and enabling the culture of impunity that had protected Rodriguez for so long. The entire department was placed under federal oversight, with new policies requiring mandatory body cameras with triple redundancy, backup systems that made malfunctions impossible. But the most important change came in the form of justice delayed but finally delivered. The 432 cases Rodriguez had tainted were reopened and reviewed by an independent panel. Innocent people walked free from prison, their records expunged, their lives given a chance to start again. Families separated by false arrests were reunited. Communities that had lived in fear of Rodriguez and officers like him began the slow process of healing and learning to trust that justice was possible, that the system could work if good people demanded it. Rosa Delgado, the 72-year-old grandmother Rodriguez had brutalized for speaking Spanish, stood in Judge Williams's courtroom and wept as her case was dismissed and Rodriguez's conviction announced. "Thank you," she whispered through tears. "Thank you for seeing us, for believing us, for making it matter." Dr. Michael Johnson, the surgeon who'd been arrested for the crime of living in his own neighborhood, received a formal apology from the city and a settlement that would fund scholarships for young Black students pursuing careers in medicine. But more valuable than any money was the validation, the official acknowledgement that what happened to him was wrong, that he'd been right to feel violated, that his dignity had been stolen and now, in some small way, returned. Jamal Washington, the honor student whose arrest record had nearly destroyed his college prospects, had his record completely expunged. He was now in his second year at law school, determined to become the kind of attorney who fought for people like him, young people of color who encountered the justice system's darkest corners and needed someone to believe in them. Judge Williams became a national symbol of judicial courage and integrity. She was invited to speak at law schools across the country, where she shared not just the story of that terrible morning, but the deeper lesson about vigilance, about systems that protect corruption when good people remain silent, about the responsibility everyone shares to demand better. She trained police departments on constitutional policing and implicit bias. She worked with Congress on criminal justice reform legislation. She gave interviews that were watched by millions. Her calm dignity and quiet strength inspiring a generation of young people, especially young black women, to believe they could be judges, lawyers, advocates for change. But despite the national attention, Judge Williams always returned to her courthouse, to her modest apartment in Riverside, to the community that had raised her. She continued to preside over custody cases, like the Peterson hearing she'd been carrying that morning, continued to show the same care and dedication to every case regardless of its profile, continued to prove that justice wasn't about headlines or glory. It was about showing up, day after day, and treating every person with dignity. The courthouse itself was renamed in her honor, the Kesha Williams Federal Courthouse. A bronze plaque was installed near the entrance where Rodriguez had assaulted her, bearing a simple but powerful inscription. Here, justice finally found its voice. May it never be silenced again. Janet Morrison, her faithful clerk, worked with the security director to edit the surveillance footage into a training film. It was shown to every new officer, prosecutor, and judge in the district, and eventually distributed nationwide. The moment when Rodriguez's face transformed from arrogance to horror, as Judge Williams took the bench, became known simply as the reckoning, a reminder that power, unchecked, eventually meets its accounting. Officers Thompson and Davis, who had laughed while recording the assault, were convicted of federal conspiracy charges. They received 10 years each, their cases becoming textbook examples of how passive participation in injustice makes one equally culpable, how witnessing abuse and doing nothing or worse, enjoying it, destroys any claim to honor or integrity. The young lawyers who had witnessed the proceedings that day went on to become civil rights attorneys, public defenders, and advocates for systemic reform. Many of them said that watching Judge Williams that morning taught them what courage truly looked like, not the absence of fear, but the determination to do what's right despite being afraid, despite being hurt, despite facing a system that seemed designed to protect the powerful and punish the vulnerable. The county paid out millions in settlements to Rodriguez's victims. But more importantly, each person received validation. Their stories were heard, believed, and acknowledged as truth. The official apologies couldn't erase the trauma, but they could begin the process of healing, could affirm that what happened mattered, that their pain and dignity mattered. Today, a new generation of officers patrols those courthouse steps. They're trained differently, supervised closely, and held accountable immediately for any misconduct. They know the story of Officer Rodriguez and Judge Williams. It's embedded in their training, referenced in their evaluations, held up as the defining example of what happens when officers forget that the badge is a privilege earned through service, not a license for abuse. And somewhere in federal prison, Rodriguez sits in his cell, finally understanding what it means to be powerless, to be judged, to face consequences for actions he thought he'd never have to answer for. The man who once declared the courthouse his now knows a deeper truth. Justice belongs to everyone, and no one, absolutely no one, regardless of their badge or position, is above the law. On quiet mornings, Judge Williams sometimes stands at her apartment window and watches the sun rise over her city. She touches the small scar on her cheek, faint now, but permanent, and remembers. Not with bitterness, but with purpose. That terrible morning changed her life, but it also changed the lives of countless people who now have hope that justice can prevail. She thinks of her mother, who cleaned buildings at night so her daughter could dream bigger dreams. She thinks of the young Gretchen conscients who write her letters saying they want to be judges too, who see in her story proof that their voices matter, that their dignity is worth fighting for. That systems can change when brave people refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. Judge Williams returns to her courthouse each day with the same humble dedication she's always carried. She drives through the same neighborhoods, waves to the same people, stops at the same coffee shop where the owner still refuses to let her pay. "Your family," he always says, and she knows he means it, not because of what happened to her, but because of who she's always been, a daughter of this community, a woman who never forgot where she came from or who she serves. In her courtroom, she still presides with the same fairness and compassion that defined her first day on the bench 23 years ago. She listens to custody cases and remembers that behind every file are real children who need protection. She hears criminal cases and remembers that every defendant, regardless of their charges, deserves to be treated with basic human dignity. She reviews civil disputes and remembers that justice isn't just about grand gestures. It's about the everyday work of ensuring everyone gets a fair hearing. The Peterson custody case, the one she'd been reviewing that terrible morning, eventually came before her. She gave those children the careful attention they deserved, made her ruling based on evidence and their best interests, and followed up personally to ensure the family received the support services they needed. Because that's what justice looks like in practice, not headlines and viral videos, but quiet attention to every case, every person, every moment where the law touches a human life. Sometimes, late in the afternoon when the courthouse empties and she's alone in her chambers, Judge Williams takes out the briefcase she carried that morning. It's been repaired, the locks fixed, the leather cleaned, but she can still see the scuff marks from when it hit the concrete. Still remember the sound it made falling, the sight of her carefully organized files scattering in the rain. She opens it and looks at the items inside. Her judicial identification returned to her that day. The Peterson files restored and completed. A letter from Rosa Delgado, thanking her for believing when no one else would. A photo of Jamal Washington at his law school graduation, his smile bright with hope and possibility. A newspaper clipping about the policy changes that came from her courage to stand up and demand accountability. These items remind her why she does this work, why she gets up at 5:30 every morning, why she reviews files late into the night, why she carries the weight of other people's pain and problems on her shoulders. Because justice matters. Because dignity matters. Because every person who walks through courthouse doors, whether as a judge, a defendant, a victim, or a witness, deserves to be seen as fully human, worthy of respect and fair treatment under the law. Henderson stops by her chambers some evenings, still carrying guilt for not recognizing her sooner that terrible morning. "You couldn't have known," she always tells him. "And what matters is what you did when you understood. You helped make things right." He's become one of her strongest allies in the courthouse, training new bailiffs to watch for signs of abuse, to speak up when they see injustice, to remember that their role isn't just maintaining order, but protecting dignity. The culture of silence that once protected officers like Rodriguez has been replaced by a culture of accountability, where speaking up is valued more than going along. The community outside the courthouse has changed too. People walk those steps without fear now, knowing that justice is possible, that their voices can be heard, that the system, imperfect as it remains, is capable of growth and change when people demand it. Children play on the plaza where Rodriguez once terrorized their parents and grandparents, their laughter a testament to healing and hope. Judge Williams sometimes gives tours to school groups, showing them the courtrooms, explaining how the legal system works. encouraging them to see themselves as future lawyers and judges and advocates for justice. She always stops at the bronze plaque near the entrance and tells them the story, not to glorify herself, but to teach them that courage is possible, that standing up for what's right matters even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult. The law, she tells these young people, is only as good as the people who enforce it, who interpret it, who demand that it live up to its highest ideals. You are those people. Your voices matter. Your dignity matters. And when you see injustice, you have a responsibility to speak up, to stand up, to refuse to accept that things can never change. They listen with wide eyes. These children from the same neighborhoods where she grew up, facing the same challenges she once faced. And in their faces, she sees hope, the hope that the next generation will build on the progress hard-won through struggle, that they'll create a justice system that truly serves everyone equally, that they'll remember the lessons of that terrible morning and ensure nothing like it happens again. On the anniversary of that day, Judge Williams holds a ceremony at the courthouse. Rodriguez's victims speak, sharing their stories, reclaiming their voices and their dignity. Community leaders talk about the changes they've seen, the renewed trust slowly being rebuilt between law enforcement and the neighborhoods they serve. Young officers recently graduated from the academy stand and take an oath, not just a standard oath of office, but a personal commitment to uphold the dignity of every person they encounter, to see their badge as a responsibility rather than a license for power. And Judge Williams speaks last, her voice carrying across the crowd gathered on those same steps where Rodriguez once struck her. Justice, she says, isn't about revenge. It isn't about tearing people down or celebrating suffering. Justice is about restoration, restoring dignity to those who've been denied it, restoring trust in systems that have betrayed it, restoring hope to communities that have every reason to feel hopeless. She pauses, looking out at the faces before her, black and white, Latino and Asian, young and old, officers and activists, lawyers and community members. What happened to me that morning was terrible. But what came from it? The accountability, the systemic changes, the lives restored, the hope renewed. That is the power of refusing to accept injustice as inevitable. That is what happens when we demand better, when we hold systems accountable, when we remember that every person, regardless of their race or station, deserves to be treated with basic human dignity. The crowd erupts in applause. But Judge Williams isn't finished. Officer Rodriguez made choices that destroyed his life and hurt countless others. But his story doesn't have to be our story. We can choose differently. We can choose justice over power, compassion over cruelty, accountability over silence. We can choose to build a community where everyone can walk these steps without fear, where the law protects rather than punishes based on skin color, where justice truly is blind to everything except the truth. As the sun sets over the Keisha Williams Federal Courthouse, casting long shadows across the plaza, she stands at the top of the steps and remembers that terrible morning. She touches the faint scar on her cheek and feels not bitterness, but purpose. Not hatred, but hope. Not despair, but determination. Because justice, she knows, is not a destination, but a journey. It's not something you achieve once and walk away from, but something you must fight for every single day, in every case. With every person who needs someone to believe in them, to see their humanity, to stand up for their dignity. When systems and people in power try to strip it away, and as long as she has breath in her body and strength in her spirit, Judge Keisha Williams will continue that fight, not because she's special or extraordinary, but because she's a humble woman who understands what it means to be powerless, who remembers where she came from, and who refuses to let anyone else feel the way Rodriguez made her feel that morning. Justice has found its voice. And it speaks in quiet, powerful tones that echo through courtrooms and communities, reminding everyone that the law belongs to all of us, that dignity is a right, not a privilege, and that change real, lasting, meaningful change is always possible when good people refuse to stay silent. The end. Remember, justice may be blind, but she sees everything. And sometimes, when the moment is right and courage rises to meet injustice, justice wears judicial robes and carries a gavel engraved with truth. But more often, justice wears ordinary clothes and carries an ordinary briefcase, walking ordinary steps until the moment comes to stand up, speak truth, and remind the world that every person's dignity matters, that no one is above the law, and that a simple, humble woman with quiet courage can change everything.